Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Jason had never been one to dwell on illusions or chase after ghosts, but the fleeting glimpse of a woman at the airport, poised, composed, yet shrouded in quiet urgency, seared itself into his mind with a violence he could not explain. It wasn't just the way she moved, or the vague familiarity of her posture as she clutched a bag embroidered with the emblem, 5 poppies. It was the unmistakable shadow of Britt that danced behind her sunglasses, the precise tension in her shoulders, the barely concealed vulnerability in her steps. That bag, that insignia, became the symbol of something Jason thought he had lost forever but now feared had never truly been gone. It was more than a flash of recognition, it was an emotional collision between memory and possibility, a burst of longing and dread so deep it cut through his otherwise disciplined mind like shrapnel. For Jason, who had already grieved Britt's death, that moment reopened a wound he thought was long since cauterized. Everyone had accepted that Britt was dead. She had died brutally, a victim of Heather's poisoned hook, her life ended in violence and confusion. But what if that narrative had been constructed? What if that ending had been chosen deliberately, designed as an exit from a world she could no longer inhabit? Jason had to know. Not because he couldn't let go, but because he knew Britt, her intelligence, her instincts, her complexity. He knew that if she were alive and hiding, there had to be a reason more dangerous than death itself. It was that unrelenting instinct that drove Jason straight to Spinelli. Not just for his unparalleled skills in surveillance and cyber tracking, but because Spinelli understood the stakes without having to ask. Working together, it didn't take long for them to trace the 5 poppies symbol to a web of interconnected shell companies headquartered in Dubrovnik. What they discovered beneath that surface was chilling. Records, partially encrypted, hinted at a biogenetic research collective that had gone dark after a global scandal surrounding gene editing in human embryos. One of the top funders listed was none other than Professor Hank Dalton, a name Jason vaguely recalled from a WSB dossier years ago, a British geneticist whose career had imploded under accusations of human experimentation. Jason's blood ran cold. Dalton wasn't just involved, he had been building something. And now the pieces were falling together in a way Jason didn't like at all. When Jason finally touched down in Dubrovnik and began to dig, what he found shocked him to his core. Britt wasn't a captive, nor was she a woman in hiding out of fear. She was there by choice. She had vanished not to escape, but to sever ties with Port Charles forever, because she had become entangled in something far more complex, something ethically damning and scientifically revolutionary. Dalton hadn't just been her mentor or a former lover. He had been her partner in a clandestine genetic engineering initiative, one that sought to construct superior human genomes through stolen fertilized embryos. Leaked documentation suggested one such embryo had given rise to none other than Rocco Falconeri. But Britt's involvement wasn't passive. She had actively helped Dalton bury the research when the heat intensified, using her mother Liesel's medical credentials to reroute and obscure data trails. She had facilitated the project's survival long after it was meant to be dismantled, ensuring the truth never surfaced. And when it became clear that she was being watched, when whispers of betrayal reached her ears, she did the only thing she could do to protect herself and Dalton: she staged her death. She left behind everything, her name, her alliances, and the last remnants of her identity. What the world saw as tragedy was, in fact, her final act of control. Her return to Port Charles now, though seismic, was never meant to be permanent. It was tactical. Strategic. Calculated. She had come back for one reason: to neutralize a threat. That threat, unknown to Carly herself, came in the form of an encrypted storage drive that Liesel had left with her before her disappearance. That device, once thought harmless, contained fragments of Dalton's raw data that, if exposed, would dismantle every cover Britt had constructed. Carly had no idea of its true nature, only that it might be valuable or dangerous. But Britt knew. And she also knew that if Carly ever decided to dig, it would be too late to undo the damage. Therefore, Britt returned not to reconnect or apologize, but to intervene before Carly became a casualty in a war she didn't even realize she was part of. She stayed in the shadows, approaching Brooke Lynn first, whose investigations into Rocco's genetic lineage had grown increasingly reckless. Each breadcrumb Brooke Lynn uncovered brought her closer to detonating a decades-old truth bomb that would destroy the Falconeri family's sense of identity. Britt carefully redirected her, planting misinformation, delaying her progress, and muddying the waters just enough to buy time. With Carly, she used more subtle tactics, whispers, third parties, carefully orchestrated chaos. She never intended to confront Jason. That would complicate things. She couldn't afford to awaken old attachments or open doors that had to stay closed. And so, she lingered on the periphery like a ghost, intervening quietly, precisely, and then fading before her presence could be confirmed. Meanwhile, the chain reaction had already begun. If Rocco ever discovered he was not the product of love or science, but rather a genetically manipulated construct, it would not just devastate him. It would collapse the fragile framework of Dante and Lulu's family, erode their trust in the world, and call into question every moral fiber of their shared legacy. Britt knew that. She bore that weight with a cold, clinical resolve. Her actions were not driven by guilt or emotion, but by duty, to Dalton, to science, and, in some twisted way, to protect the very people she had deceived. Dalton, now an invisible force observing from the shadows, had constructed a surveillance network under the codename 5 Poppies. It wasn't just a symbol, it was a code that tied Britt to a chain of operatives and researchers who still believed in the work they had begun. She wasn't just a cog in that machine, she was its memory core. The last one who had seen all the blueprints, carried the ethical burdens, and knew exactly where the limits were breached. She had to erase every trace before the network dissolved into scandal. That meant Britt's time in Port Charles would be brief, days, maybe even hours. Long enough to recover the drive, disrupt Carly's pursuit, redirect Brooke Lynn, and vanish once again. And when she left, she would not leave behind any goodbyes. There would be no final glance, no heartfelt closure. Just a sudden void. One that Jason, despite all his instincts and battle-hardened detachment, would feel like a phantom limb. He would search for answers she'd never offer, haunted by the knowledge that she had returned only to clean up a mess she once helped create. Britt's reappearance wasn't an invitation for healing. It was a surgical strike, a brief, sharp incision into the story of Port Charles, one that would leave scar tissue long after she was gone. And Jason would carry that wound, invisible and silent, knowing she had been there and chose not to stay. Because the Britt he remembered had died the night of the poisoned hook. The woman who returned was something else entirely, brilliant, ruthless, and, once again, lost to him forever. Jason finally understood the real reason why Britt's eyes had never stopped haunting him, not because he couldn't let her go, but because, in the most elusive and terrifying sense, she had never truly left. For so long, he had told himself that the pain he carried was grief, that the memories replaying in his mind were a natural byproduct of loss. But now, as the puzzle pieces of the past began to lock into place with a clarity that chilled him to the bone, Jason saw the full picture emerge, and Britt was no longer the lost lover, no longer the tragic victim of a poisoned hook, but something far more devastating, a keystone in a sprawling, hidden narrative he had never even known he was part of. The truth, as it settled over him like a second skin, was cruelly precise. She had never stopped watching. Never stopped influencing the board. And her recent return to Port Charles was not the beginning of a new chapter, but a calculated comma in a sentence Britt herself had begun writing long ago. She had mapped out every move before even stepping foot on familiar soil. From the hour of her arrival to the exact moment of her departure, every action was part of a script designed not for emotional closure, but for damage control. She wasn't there to confess, to reconnect, or to repair. She was there to contain. To neutralize threats. To wipe away fingerprints from a conspiracy that had long ago spiraled beyond anyone's control. Dalton's project had once promised scientific revolution, but now, it was a ticking time bomb. And the moment Carly unknowingly inherited a device that could decrypt years of forbidden data, including the origin of Rocco and a generation of genetically modified children, Britt had no choice but to act. She had to extinguish the fuse before the entire legacy she tried to bury reignited in the wrong hands. There were no confrontations. No tearful reunions. No chance to say the things that had gone unsaid for too long. Britt moved like a shadow across the familiar landscape, slipping in and out of private spaces with the silent precision of someone who had once belonged here, but now merely passed through. Her presence was a ghost's whisper, brushing past Brooke Lynn's investigation just long enough to reroute it, to confuse the timeline, to blur the facts into dreams. Britt left Brooke Lynn with the vague sensation that she had encountered something, or someone, meaningful. But by the time she turned to look, the figure had vanished, like mist dissolving in sunlight. With Nina and Cody, her image hovered like a mirage, half recognized from across a crowded room or glimpsed in a car's rearview mirror. Their memories, altered by doubt and time, wouldn't trust themselves enough to confirm she had been there. It was just a flicker. A trick of the light. Or maybe it had been someone else entirely. Only Jason would receive something close to an answer. But even that would come too late. Buried deep in an encrypted file recovered by Spinelli, something neither of them had initially understood the significance of, was a short, clinical message. No signature. No sentiment. Just 4 words etched into Jason's heart like acid: I am gone. Don't follow. And that was the end. There would be no trail, no second message, no hidden code embedded in metadata. Britt's final act was one of absolute erasure. Of herself, her intentions, and every trace of emotion that might have compelled Jason to try again. She left him with nothing, because anything more would have undone the delicate balance she had restored. Her presence in Port Charles had always been on borrowed time. Any longer, and the whole tapestry of secrets she had worked to suppress would unravel, taking innocent lives and reputations down with it. Jason stood in the wake of her absence, knowing now that the image of Britt had never really left him because she had never truly stopped pulling strings from behind the curtain. And now that she was gone, this time, permanently, he was left not with hope, not with closure, but with a truth so sharp it could not be spoken aloud. She had come back, not for him, but for the story she needed to end. Not for love, but for silence. Not to rekindle what was lost, but to protect what must never be found. And this was the cruelest irony of all, that the woman who had once cracked open the most guarded parts of his soul, who had seen through the layers of soldier, assassin, and protector, had returned not as a companion, not even as a memory seeking refuge, but as a final cipher in a world he could never fully understand. Britt was never going to stay. She had never intended to. Her return was not a resurrection, but a final audit. A surgical removal of the loose thread she had left behind, so that the fragile illusion of normalcy could continue for everyone else. Jason would carry the knowledge alone, because it was too heavy to share, and too fragmented to explain. Britt had walked into his life as fire, burned through his defenses, and exited as smoke, intangible, ungraspable, but still filling his lungs with every breath. And now, with her gone for good, all he could do was remember. Not the way she died. Not the woman she pretended to be. But the brilliant, tortured, uncompromising strategist she had become. A woman who knew the cost of the truth, and paid it with her own disappearance. Sometimes, Jason realized, the people we lose aren't the ones who die. Sometimes, they're the ones who choose to vanish, so that we may live unburdened by their reality. And sometimes, the deepest pain doesn't come from death, but from the knowledge that someone once reached for your heart, only to retreat into shadows for the greater good. Britt had returned only to disappear. A final move on a board only she could see. A scar he would carry in silence, forever. The fleeting nature of Britt's return to Port Charles was never meant to be interpreted as weakness, and in truth, it was quite the opposite. Her brevity was intentional. A precision strike, honed through 2 long years of isolation, survival, and ruthless self-reinvention. In the time the world believed her dead, Britt had been living beyond borders, existing on the periphery of legality and morality, orbiting a truth so dangerous it had to remain hidden at all costs. She had shed her former identity like a skin, built a life in shadows, and grown accustomed to the solitude that came with knowing she could never go home. And yet, when the axis of that silence threatened to tilt, when a single piece of evidence slipped through the cracks and landed in Carly's hands, Britt knew it was time to come back, not for redemption, not for reunion, but for containment. She had precisely one goal: to erase a dangerous past before it became an unstoppable present. Time had become a commodity Britt could no longer afford. Every hour she spent back in Port Charles increased the chances that someone, Jason, Spinelli, Brooke Lynn, or even Carly herself, might recognize the web she had once helped weave. She had crafted her return like a tactical operation: no traceable flights, no credit card transactions, no phone signals. Her identity was sealed behind layers of encryption, her movements untraceable. The name, Britt Westbourne, existed only as a memory, and even that was fading. What she had become in her time away was something harder to name. Part scientist, part fugitive, part guardian of a terrible secret. She moved through the city like a phantom, careful not to leave footprints. She wore her invisibility like a shield, navigating alleys and back entrances, avoiding the eyes of those who might recognize her and remember. But she was not afraid. Fear was something she had dismantled long ago, brick by brick, replaced with discipline, with resolve, with the kind of icy conviction that made her capable of returning to the city that once defined her and walking away again without looking back. And when she acted, when she intercepted the device Carly had been safeguarding, the encrypted drive that housed the last fragments of Dalton's gene manipulation data, she did so without hesitation. She didn't need forgiveness. She needed finality. No one saw her do it. There were no confrontations. No unmasking. She slipped into Carly's home through a back door that hadn't been alarmed, disabled the security system with a code she had memorized years ago, and took exactly what she came for. Not the drive itself, but access. She plugged it into her device, initiated a full system reprogramming protocol designed to erase every trace of Dalton's research while leaving the drive seemingly untouched. When Carly returned to find it still in place, still humming with hidden files, she had no idea those files were now nothing more than scrambled static, irrecoverable even by Spinelli. It was surgical, brilliant, irreversible. When Jason later returned to the clinic where he believed he had glimpsed Britt, there was nothing left. The medical equipment stood untouched. The blinds hung still. The air felt stagnant, as if no one had breathed there in days. Yet he knew, somehow, instinctively, that she had been there. That she had stood where he now stood. That she had touched the same doorknob, scanned the same screens, and made her final decision within these sterile walls. He had come too late. But even if he had come sooner, Britt would never have let herself be found. She had made her choice before she even boarded the transport that brought her back. And still, despite her absolute resolve, the emotional weight of her return could not be denied. Not for Jason. Not for the few who unknowingly crossed her path. There were moments, faint and quickly dismissed, when Brooke Lynn paused mid-sentence, as if remembering a face she couldn't place. When Nina caught sight of a woman in a scarf at the Metro Court and felt a strange, unplaceable pull. When Cody woke from a dream in which Britt's laugh echoed faintly, then faded before he could call her name. These fragments, these half-impressions, were the only traces she allowed to remain. A whisper of what had once been, quickly lost to time. Jason, however, received the cruelest mercy of all, a truth without closure. When Spinelli decrypted an abandoned cache on a server they thought had been dormant for years, he found only one file intact. It contained a string of characters that resolved into a message so concise, so final, it left Jason breathless: "I am gone. Don't follow." That was it. No explanation. No goodbye. No hint of where she had gone or what she would become next. Just the echo of her absence, cold and definitive, like a door slammed shut in a burning house. Jason understood then that he had not misread her eyes in that final moment at the clinic. He had seen the truth. Britt had come not to be saved, but to save others from the ruin she once helped build. Her return was a scalpel's cut, precise, necessary, meant to sever the past from the present. And then she was gone, without a trace, leaving only the wound she had carved behind. Carly eventually realized the truth, though she never said it aloud. One day, she opened the encrypted device again, determined to finally uncover its contents, only to find that every file had been wiped clean. There was no explanation, no malfunction. Just erasure. Complete and irreversible. In that moment, she felt it, not fear, but the quiet certainty that someone had intervened. Someone who knew exactly what that drive contained. Someone who understood that some truths weren't meant to survive. No one saw Britt leave. There were no tickets, no passport scans, no airport footage. Even the cameras in the harbor district, usually reliable, had blacked out for a 10-minute window. Jason would later wonder if she had orchestrated even that. He would never know. And he would never see her again. But the silence she left behind was louder than anything she could have said. Jason carried it with him like a phantom pain, a reminder that not all losses are loud or violent. Some end with a whisper. Some vanish like vapor.